Hey, what is up guys, and welcome to a new 3D Pilot tutorial. In this tutorial I will tell you everything you need to know about resolution. Do note that I will not be talking about the empty promises you make at New Year's Eve with your family. So first I will be discussing some terminology. I'll be talking about pixel count, resolution, pixel density, about aspect ratio, and also I'll be talking a bit about 3D mesh resolution. I am a 3D guy after all. You might have heard of these terms already, but might not know exactly what they mean or what they're used for. And after this, I will be discussing how you work with resolution and exactly how much resolution you need and in what case. I'll also be giving some tips and tricks on both generating high resolution images and maintaining the high resolution that you created all the way to the end. So some terminology. Now the pixel count of an image is the total amount of pixels that make up an image. So a pixel is the smallest building block of an image. It's mostly a square little block of color, and all these blocks of color together make up an image. So the total amount of pixels is often denoted in megapixels. So 1 megapixel means that there's 1 million pixels in your image. Now, for example, a Full HD TV has about 2 megapixels in resolution, which is not that much actually. Your old Nokia cellular phone could probably shoot at 2 megapixels. But this is what you need for a clear image, both in video and pictures that should be displayed on a television or a monitor of that sort. The maximum resolution that a printer, a standard inkjet printer, can get on an A4 paper is about 4 megapixels. A 4K TV, which is simply 4 times the resolution of a Full HD TV, has about 8 megapixels. Most modern cameras shoot at about 20 megapixels, which is quite a lot if you consider the other resolutions, but it allows you to crop the image and get some detail in places where it's needed and zoom in. So the actual resolution. So as you can probably see in the bottom bar of this video, you can select the video quality and you see some numbers, 480p, 1080p. And you might wonder what these mean. Well, that's actually the horizontal amount of pixels that your image has. So the resolution, a full resolution, is the horizontal pixel count and times the vertical pixel count. Now you might have noticed the P that stands after the resolution. That's actually for the progressive scanning of the lines of your video. That's not really important, the difference between progressive and interlaced video. If you want to know more about it, you can check the links in the description. There'll be the video down there. It doesn't really matter for us for now. So the older kind of TV, the old big box that's maybe standing in your grandma's room somewhere, probably has a resolution of about 640 by 480. That's kind of enough for a kind of clear image, but we don't use it often because it's actually way too low for video. After that, HD came along, which has a resolution of 1280 by 720, and that was quickly overruled by the Full HD resolution of 1920 by 1080 pixels. This Full HD resolution is used very often in video, and I think it's kind of a golden mean between having enough pixels for a good clear image and not having to mess around with too much data. Just as an extra, a A4 printer, inkjet printer, can print about 2300 by 1600 pixels. Now if you want to step it up a notch and go to 4K resolution, you've got 3940 by 2160 pixels. So that's quite a lot. I don't use it often because there's not that many monitors or TVs out there that actually play this format. And the difference between Full HD and 4K is actually quite small to the eye. So I recommend definitely for video using the Full HD of 1920 by 1080 pixels. Alright, so pixel density. Now this is actually the up-close sharpness of an image. This is often noted in pixels per inch, PPI. So that means that if you took a screen or an image of any sort and measured out 1 inch, then you could count the amount of pixels that make up that inch. And then you've got the number of pixels per inch. So the PPI defines the up-close sharpness. So if you go really close to a screen, it can mean that the pixels are almost invisible. Or maybe they're quite large, like on a cinema screen, it might be actually this big. But since you're standing far away in a cinema screen, or sitting rather, the pixels appear very small and you've got a lot of pixels on that big screen, so the video still looks good. Now, for example, a standard 40-inch Full HD TV has about a pixel density of 50 ppi, so that's 50 pixels per inch. So if you take that same Full HD resolution and scale it down to the size of a monitor, like the one on your laptop or your desktop PC, you've got the same amount of pixels in a smaller space. So the PPI goes up to around 72 pixels per inch, which is standard for most monitors. Now an inkjet printer can go quite high, something like 200 pixels per inch actually. A pixel density which is just topped by most smartphones. Most smartphones have about a pixel density of 250 pixels per inch. Now you might have heard of a Retina display. That's a marketing term invented by Apple. But a Retina display has a pixel density of about 300 pixels per inch. So if you go up to a 300 pixels per inch screen, You go really up close, you can maybe sort of make out the pixels, but from a normal viewing distance, you can't see the pixels anymore. They're just too small. So there's really no point in going any higher in your pixel density than 300. Next up is aspect ratio. So the aspect ratio is actually the ratio between the horizontal and the vertical size of your image. It defines how square or rectangular your image or monitor is. So take for example a square aspect ratio. That's got an aspect ratio of 1:1. Then we go to the aspect ratio of most old TVs or old monitors, which is 4:3. So that means if your image was 4 inches wide, it would be 3 inches tall. A standard photo from most cameras, or the ones that you get printed, are a 3:2 aspect ratio. Now an aspect ratio that you're watching this video in, and that most video is in for the moment, is 16:9. This is called widescreen, so most TVs on the market right now are widescreen televisions. Now there's one more aspect ratio that you can maybe see in the cinema, or maybe you've got an advanced monitor at home and you have this, is a 21:9 aspect ratio. So that's actually like a standard monitor that you're watching on right now probably, with some extra room to the side. This gives you more of a horizon kind of feel. Now these were all terms used in 2D image editing. Now I'll be talking about the 3D mesh resolution. Because if you're rendering or if you are printing something in 3D, you will always be using a mesh. A mesh is kind of like pixels. It's also made up of a bunch of flat little faces, small building blocks if you want. So even if your model has really smooth curves and all organic shapes, the mesh is still made up of lots and lots and lots of tiny flat faces. So with 3D mesh resolution, I'm referring to the density of the faces that make up a smooth surface. Take for example this model. It's made up of a bunch of little triangles, as you can see. Now you can't really see the shape very well, you can't really make out what it is. So let's add a little more faces. Now you start to see the actual shape of the object. So this is actually the monkey head that is preset in Blender. If I increase the mesh resolution even more, you can see the actual smoothness of the surface coming through. So as I said, the more faces you have, the smoother your object becomes. And that counts for both rendering and 3D printing. Keep that in mind. But it doesn't look all the way smooth yet, so do I have to increase it even further? Well, that's one way to do it, but it's really heavy on your computer. Because the more faces you have, the more memory your PC has to use, and the slower your PC gets. It just slows down every kind of software you don't want at. So instead of just making the faces so small that you can't see them anymore, we use a smooth shading effect. So while our mesh is still made up of flat faces, the PC now tries to smooth out the surface and blend the different vertices and faces into each other, so you get a bit of a smooth surface. So in this monkey head you can see it's got smooth shading. You can still kind of see the outline is a bit jagged, it's not fully round, but you don't really notice the big faces anymore. Now this is really cool for rendering, but you can't use it for 3D printing. For 3D printing you're stuck at using a high resolution. Take these two shapes for example. The left one has got quite a low resolution, while the one on the right has a higher resolution. You can clearly see the flat faces making up the bevels on this object, which are actually supposed to be round. So here you should increase the amount of flat faces so you can no longer see them as individual triangles. Now if you are using Blender or any kind of modeling program that uses polygons, you're going to want to adjust the subdivisions. So in Blender you can find it under the modifiers tab right under here. So adjust these levels until your model has got the right amount of smoothness. So for rendering I use about 3 subdivisions with smooth shading, and for printing I would use 4 subdivisions and have it printed out that way. If you are exporting your mesh from a 3D CAD program, just like SolidWorks, you'll be using a maximum deviation and angle. So while exporting your STL file, you can actually find the resolution over here under the options and set the deviation and angle yourself. Now there's 2 presets, fine and coarse. Now fine works great for most things, but if I want to make a really high resolution render or print, I often set the resolution to custom and adjust the angle up to something a little bit smaller and the deviation as well. So that gives me a lot more triangles and a lot more smoothness in my surfaces. Now working with resolution. How much do we actually need? That's the big question. Now the first thing to ask yourself is, what am I using it for? Am I going to print this? Am I going to put this on a website? Am I going to make a video out of this? It all depends on what your goal is. So you definitely want to use a high resolution standard, but you have to know when enough is actually enough, because too many pixels and too high resolution, as I said, can slow things down. So for example, if I'm printing an A4 document, the most important thing to consider is the pixel density, because you will be looking at it up close. So if I print something, I make sure that nothing has a lower pixel density than 150 pixels per inch. If I'm printing out a big poster, like A3 format, I don't need to have the pixel density quite as high. So I can get away with 70 pixels per inch most of the time. This is because you won't be up close to the poster, you'll be standing from afar and watching the image as a whole. Now, if I'm making a slide presentation that I know will be projected on a screen, I don't know the pixel density because I don't know how big the actual screen will be. So much more important is the aspect ratio and the resolution. So for slideshow, I will mostly be using 1440 by 1080 pixels. So that comes down to a 4:3 aspect ratio, as most projectors still use the 4:3 aspect ratio. If I'm making a video, the resolution will be about the same, but I'll be using 1920 by 1080 because I've now got a 16:9 aspect ratio to work with. So for the mesh resolution, when 3D printing and rendering, in Blender I often go for something like 3 or 4 subdivisions to get the most out of my mesh. Or when I'm exporting from SolidWorks, I will be using about a 10-degree angle or smaller and a 0.5mm deviation. If you really need your print perfectly spotless, you can bring down these numbers even more. And now for some tips and tricks on generating and maintaining high pixel densities and resolution. So when you're making photo and video, make sure that you capture your footage at a high resolution. So ditch that old compact camera you've got lying around. It's maybe even better to shoot with the camera of your smartphone. Now do keep in mind that you shouldn't be using too many megapixels. Let me put it this way. To capture the light coming off of the object that you're trying to photograph, your camera uses a sensor. Now, depending on the amount of megapixels you have in your camera, this sensor will be divided up into really small squares. Now, the more megapixels you have, the more squares you need to fit in the sensor. So when you need to cram all these sensor squares into a small sensor, their size has to decrease. Now, the smaller a single light capturing square is, the less light it can actually receive. And the less light it can receive, the more room there is for failure. And the more failure you have, the more grain you have in your image, and your image starts to look kind of blurry, even though you've got all these pixels. So it's fine to shoot at 10 megapixels, maybe even 20, but there's cameras out there that got like 40 or 50 megapixels. That's actually kind of useless in most cases, unless you've got a really big DSLR and you know what you're doing. Also try to have enough light on the thing that you're trying to photograph. The more light there is, the more light that gets into the sensor, and the clearer your image becomes. A darker image has a lot of grain and a lot of blurriness to it. So always have enough light on what you're trying to photograph or make a video of. So of course when you're rendering, you've got it all to yourself. You can render out as many pixels as you want. Go high enough, but don't go over the top. There's no need for a 10,000 by 10,000 pixel render. It'll only take a lot of your time and a lot of frustration getting that into Photoshop. And for your 3D models, of course, use a high resolution 3D mesh. Now for the other graphical elements that you're trying to create, be sure to use vector graphics whenever it's possible. Now, if you're not sure what vector graphics is, here's a little example. So there's two kinds of graphics. There's raster graphics and vector graphics. A raster graphic is what you'll come across in Microsoft Paint or Photoshop. Every image you see is made up of little squares. The more squares you have, the better your image looks. Now this is fine until you try to scale things up. For example, this letter E is scaled up all the way, and you can really see the pixels on the outline. As you can see, this looks really crappy. Now vector graphics solves this problem. Instead of using square pixels, it uses lines and curves. These curves are defined as mathematical functions, so however far you zoom into them, they remain smooth curves. I like to make the analogy to SolidWorks versus Blender. In Blender, the concept of a sphere doesn't really exist. You can have a lot of faces that kind of make up a shape that looks like a sphere, but it'll never be a perfect sphere. If you go to SolidWorks, you can actually model a perfect sphere, defined by a center point and a radius. So in this case, Blender is kind of like a raster image with a lot of pixels. So SolidWorks is like vector graphics that can have perfect mathematically defined curves. Now as a last thing, whenever you're working with images, try to work with a lossless compression image format. I'll try to explain what this means. So an image is made up of a lot of pixels. The more pixels you have, the better. Now, one way to store all this information is to go to the first top left pixel and say, okay, it's that much green, that much red, and that much blue. Then go to the next pixel, that much green, that much red, that much blue, and store all these files. Now that's a way to do it, but that would take up a lot of space, a lot of room, a lot of memory. So some really clever engineers came up with ways to compress these files. For example, take this plane graphic. You can see that the top left pixel is blue, but the one next to it is blue as well. So there's no reason to define that color all again. So it just says, so it's this blue and it's all the way up to that point, it's just blue. And then under it, it's just the same until it crosses some gray. Then it turns to gray and that's gray all the way. While this does seem a little more complex, it actually saves a lot of memory. Now this compression can happen both lossless and lossy. A PNG file is a perfect example of a lossless compression format. So the image is compressed, the file size does get smaller, but no actual image quality is lost. By using JPEG, however, some information is lost. So while you can see that these two planes have the same resolution, the quality is actually not the same. Definitely around the sharp edges where sharp contrasts meet, you can see that there is a lot of ugly artifacts. And JPEG compression can actually shrink your files a lot more than PNG can, but you'll have to cope with the ugly artifacts, which we don't want. And now the last topic, how to maintain this high resolution throughout your product up until the end. So one of the most important things, and one of the reasons I'm making this video, is to say this. Don't send images through Facebook, not on the Messenger, not by posting it on a page. Why not? When you upload an image to Facebook, Facebook first converts it to a really small file size, but in the process, a lot of resolution and a lot of quality of your image is actually lost. If you really need to send someone an image through Facebook, first pack your images into a zip file and send that zip file as the file. Then your receiver can open the file and get the images in full quality. Now, as I said, work with a lossless compression image format. So stay away from JPEG. I use PNG most of the time because every program that I have uses it. It's a smaller file size as a raw image and it just suits my needs. Now next up, when you're resizing an image, do it smart. So I'll give you a little example. So for the moment I'm in Photoshop. So let's say I've got this drill and I'm making some kind of a mood board. And I've got this great image, but I don't need it this big. So I rescale it a little bit, make it a little bit smaller, put it on the edge somewhere. I'll use it some other time. All right, there we go. Then I go on and do some other things, like make some other layers. Doesn't really matter. Now, after a while I say, well, this drill, it looked kind of good. I want it big again. And I scale it back up and there we go. But look what it did. Before we could really see all the details in this drill and now it's just all kind of blurry. That's because we rescaled it. Photoshop resized the image and then we scaled it back up. So as you can see, that's not a good way to do it. I'll just go back in history by doing this. There we go. So this is the original image, much clearer as you can see. Now before rescaling the image, I will first go here. I will first go to my layer and then here go to convert to smart object. So I click that. And now whenever I rescale the image, I can make it really small, doesn't really matter. I can again do whatever I want. If I want to go back and change the size again, and I scale it up again, all the resolution is still there. I've still got all the detail that I wanted. So in Photoshop, using the Smart Object tool is really recommended. And now lastly, as I just demonstrated, don't scale up small images that have got really low resolution. It'll look terrible, it'll look cheap, and it'll definitely not look professional. So thank you so much for watching my video again. As always, hit like, hit subscribe and hit the little bell button so you can get notified whenever new videos pop up. You can find me right here on YouTube or on Facebook/3dpilot. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments below or post something on Facebook. I'll be sure to check your feedback every day. You guys mean the world to me, so thanks a lot for watching and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye!